Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is August 19th. On this day in 1991, a neighborhood already rife with tension erupted into violence. Crown Heights, Brooklyn, a community that was home to both Caribbean immigrants and Hasidic Jews, was torn apart by 3 days of rioting. And in the middle of that firestorm, a visiting Jewish scholar named Yankel Rosenbaum was stabbed to death by a teenager. Today, we're talking about the murder of Yankel Rosenbaum, the riots that surrounded it, and how they became the subject of years of trials, outrage, and attempts at reconciliation. Let's get started. It all began with an accident. On the evening of August 19, 1991, a car in the motorcade of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the spiritual leader of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement, lost control on President Street in Crown Heights. The driver, 22-year-old Yosef Lifsh, veered onto the sidewalk where two young Guyanese cousins, Gavin and Angela Cato, were playing. 7-year-old Gavin was killed instantly. His cousin, who was also 7, was critically injured. It was a horrible, awful accident, but to the crowd gathering on the street, it didn't feel like one. It felt like confirmation of years of inequality. Rumors spread quickly that police and Jewish-run ambulance services had rushed to save the driver instead of the children, and that the system once again valued one life over another. As anger swelled, chants erupted. Let's go to Kingston Avenue and get a Jew. Mobs moved through the Jewish section of the neighborhood, smashing windows, overturning cars, and hurling bottles and rocks at homes marked with mezuzot. That first night gave way to 2 more days of violence. Stores were looted, fires were set, and residents were assaulted. Police struggled to contain it. Black and Jewish New Yorkers alike were injured. Millions of dollars of damage scarred the neighborhood. And by the time the smoke cleared, Crown Heights was no longer just a Brooklyn neighborhood. It was a symbol of America's racial fault lines. Among the chaos was Yankel Rosenbaum. Yankel was a 29-year-old graduate student visiting New York from Melbourne, Australia. He was soft-spoken, scholarly, and deeply rooted in his Jewish identity. Yankel had come to Brooklyn for research, not conflict. But in the early hours of August 20th, while walking near Eastern Parkway, he became a target. A group of young men spotted him. Leading that group was 16-year-old Lemmerk Nelson, who had been emboldened by the mob's chants. Nelson plunged a knife into Yankel multiple times before fleeing into the night. Bleeding heavily, Yankel managed to identify his attacker. At Kings County Hospital, he pointed Nelson out in a lineup, but fate dealt him another cruel blow. Doctors missed a deep stab wound to his chest, an injury that caused internal bleeding. Hours later, despite surviving the initial attack, Yankel Rosenbaum died. His death was a devastating punctuation mark on the violence that was already gripping Crown Heights. A promising life was ended not just by hatred, but also by medical negligence. Police had their suspect. Yankel himself had identified Lemmerk Nelson, and many believe that the case was straightforward. But what followed showed just how fraught and complicated justice can be. In 1992, Nelson went on trial in state court. Despite eyewitness testimony, Yankel's dying identification, and other evidence that Nelson was indeed the attacker, the jury acquitted him of murder. The verdict shocked the Jewish community and outraged Rosenbaum's family in Australia. Critics accused the jury of bowing to racial polarization, saying that they saw Nelson not as an individual, but as a symbol, and acquitted him in defiance of the broader narrative. For Mayor David Dinkins, New York's first black mayor, the case became a political lightning rod. Jewish leaders accused his administration of failing to protect their community during riots. Black residents accused him of caving to Jewish demands. The unrest and its aftermath would haunt his time in office and, many believe, contributed to his loss to Rudy Giuliani the following year. But the Rosenbaum family refused to let the story end with the acquittal. Under pressure from civil rights advocates, federal prosecutors took up the case under civil rights statutes, arguing that Rosenbaum was attacked because of his religion and ethnicity. In 1997, Nelson was retried in federal court alongside Charles Price, the man accused of inciting the mob with his shouts of "Get a Jew." This time the evidence held. Both men were convicted. Nelson was sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison, and Price received his own lengthy sentence. It was a rare and significant moment. The federal government stepped in to prosecute anti-Semitic violence where the state had failed. Still, for Yankel's loved ones, no sentence could restore what had been lost. The riots exposed fractures that had been years in the making. Crown Heights had long been the home to one of the largest Lubavitcher Jewish communities outside of Israel, living side by side with Caribbean immigrants and African Americans. For years, residents had complained of unequal treatment by city services, housing disparities, and simmering resentments between the groups. The death of Gavin Cato and the murder of Yankel Rosenbaum didn't create these tensions, they detonated them. The riot became a defining event that shaped New York politics for decades. Yet, out of tragedy also came efforts for healing. In the years after the riots, community leaders from both sides began dialogues to ease the bitterness. Interfaith groups held forums and neighborhood programs were launched to encourage cooperation. While mistrust never disappeared, the work planted seeds for coexistence in a community that was too deeply intertwined to divide completely. For Yankel Rosenbaum's family, the pain was permanent. His brother, Norman Rosenbaum, became a relentless advocate for justice. He stood at rallies, gave interviews, and kept Yankel's name in the public eye. His voice became synonymous with the demand for accountability. Even after he returned to Australia, Norman carried his brother's memory into every conversation about Crown Heights. Decades later, journalists, filmmakers, and historians still revisit those 3 days in August. But since then, Crown Heights itself has changed. Gentrification has altered its demographics, and intercommunal relations are calmer than they were in 1991. But the scars remain visible to those who lived through it. For some, Yankel Rosenbaum's story is about the failure of local justice and the need for federal intervention. For others, it's about the danger of letting mistrust fester in diverse neighborhoods. And for his family, it's always about a life that was cut short. A young scholar far from home who was killed simply for who he was. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Yankel's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!